Hello and welcome. Today we'll be discussing an interesting topic, new economic order in post-COVID situation. I'm delighted to have with us Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh. Before I start, let me introduce Dr. Ghosh to all of you. Dr. Ghosh is the director of ORF Kolkata. Before joining ORF, Dr. Ghosh was the senior vice president and chief economist of MCX. He also served as professor of econometrics at Teddy School of Advanced Studies, New Delhi. Dr. Ghosh obtained his PhD from IIM Kolkata and his degree in economics from Jadavpur University. He is a leading ecological economist, development analyst of South Asia, a thought leader, and is considered a pioneer in the application of neoclassical economics in water governance. Dr. Ghosh has 50 plus research papers, articles, 8 books and monographs to his credit. Welcome, Dr. Ghosh.
Thank you.
Before I start, let me tell you about the house rule. As you can see, there is one chat icon where you can post your questions. And I would request Dr. Ghosh to respond to some of the questions. Dr. Ghosh, we are discussing an important topic today, that is new economic order in post-COVID situation. We have been witnessing changes even before the pandemic, with Brexit, with USA-China trade war, with USA withdrawing from Trans-Pacific Partnership. And after the pandemic, I think economies have become more insulated. So my question to you is, how do you perceive the global economic and political order to change in the post-COVID world?
It's a very interesting dynamics that is unfolding, in fact, especially with this pandemic. As you rightly mentioned, that there has been some kind of a flux in the global economic and the political order. The way, in fact, the status quo has been perceived, it is as if that the Occident is going to rule the roost. So we had the global North and the global South, and eventually the global North depended on the global South for the various factors of production, because of course it was perceived that you have a huge amount of human capital. And what we also noticed, in fact, particularly right from the 50s and the 60s, ever since the processes of decolonization started happening, that there was a phenomenon known as brain drain. That is the human capital movement from here to the West. But on the other hand, from the 60s and the 70s onwards, we found the emergence of the tiger economies. Then we found, of course, the very critical emergence of China. And the most critical blow to the status quo in the global economic order, I would say, was the very conceptualization and announcement and declaration across the globe of about the Belt and Road Initiative of China. And if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, this rocked the global economic order, and in fact conceptualized around 7 years ago. And it was a global development strategy which involved infrastructure development, investments in nearly 70 nations. First of all, to exploit the chief factor markets, which existed, in fact, in South Asia as well as Africa, and also to capture the expanding product or the commodity markets. So, and as you rightly mentioned, that there was, on the other hand, whereas China's BRI was actually conceived of as some kind of a second Marshall Plan, though I perceived it as a restatement of the East India Company model. All they thought was essentially market imperialism. But the very idea of the status quo in the global political and economic order was challenged by the BRI on the one hand. On the other hand, it was challenged by those who were essentially the dominant players in the global economic and political order. So this actually happened because of the emergence of what we call the strongman leaders all across the world. Then the dominance of the very nationalistic fervors, which emerged from what I call a very xenophobic discernment of some of the major nations, and insulating tendencies of economies, as you rightly mentioned. But even among these, when you are having withdrawal from the TPP or the Trans-Pacific Partnership of the US, the prolonged US-China trade war, the very Trumpian disregard of the climate change crisis, the Brexit, China's BRI was gaining momentum with nations from the European Union, Asia, and Latin America joining in. And this marked the happy ride of China on its BRI horse. On the other hand, this was attempted to be combated by a few coalitions, like suppose what we have the Quad or the Quadrilateral in the very Indo-Pacific, which is a potential security arrangement among four large democracies, especially Australia, India, Japan, and US. And then came COVID-19. So the spread of the virus didn't take time, with more than 200 nations being affected in varying degrees. And the most interesting observation is that economies with the highest levels of exposure to China, either through the Belt and Road Initiative or otherwise, are the ones which are the most affected by the virus. In fact, in one of my ongoing research, I have found that there are at least three very critical economic variables in the form of economic exposure. One is the human capital movement, or what you call, in fact, labor migration. The other is exposure in the form of foreign trade, either export or import, and FDI, foreign direct investment of China, which has happened mostly in the BRI nations. These are three very critical and statistically significant variables which have been affecting the spread of the virus. And nations which are mostly exposed to these three variables are the ones which are the most affected ones. And this can be evinced with the case of Italy, where you have Italy was not only China's largest cooperative trade partner, but also a nation which became a BRI member in 2019. And ever since it became a BRI member, it emerged as one of the major destinations for Chinese FDI. Then you have Iran, which was one of the biggest trading partners, with massive Chinese investments and human capital movement happening. As far as South Korea is concerned, though they have managed it very well, what you will find is that a large part of they had very high exposure to China, and this occurred mostly through the assembly lines before being re-exported to other nations. So now what we are going to have is that an insulating tendency. Trade routes are being seen with a lot of suspicion. Investment in foreign destinations to exploit what we call the GVCs, or the global value chains, they are going to be cast with doubts. So this is the change that you are going to see in the global economic order as such. Now, who is going to be the winner in the process and who is going to be the loser? Of course, time is going to state that. So definitely US companies are now weighing their options, whether to move to the ASEAN economies or to move to, in fact, to India, where the rates of return are going to be way higher, precisely because of the 4K factors, that is physical capital, human capital, natural capital, and social capital, which are all four factors being available in abundance. Now, there is something very interesting that we have noted, that financial capital essentially gets drawn towards destinations where you have these 4Ks, or four factors of capital, available in abundance. So let's see who emerges as the winner or the loser in this entire game.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. My next question is, what do you mean by, what is the state of global development governance? It would be great if you can just tell us, what do you mean by development governance?
See, this is a very, very critical concern, global development governance, because see, first of all, in fact, if you look at the pattern in which development was viewed way back, especially, in fact, during the times of prior to the First World War, and ever since the times of the Industrial Revolution, it had definition, or a very reductionist delineation. And this reductionist delineation of development emerged through a mono-dimensional variable, and that is growth. So growth was viewed as expansion of the social basket of goods and services. But it didn't entail the other factors of development, especially distribution. So whereas we were only concerned with one aspect of development, that is efficiency, we completely ignored the other aspect of development, that is equity. So this was a very, very critical concern. Look at the Occidental economists, the economists of the West, especially during the prior to the First World War, even during the Industrial Revolution. Suppose Adam Smith, David Ricardo, or forget about, in fact, even talking about Karl Marx, who analyzed the capitalist society. Though in fact he talked about the concerns of development eventually came with, to a certain extent, I mean, distribution came to a certain extent, the Marxian thinking. But even then, capital formation, it remained a very, very important component of growth for centuries. And even, its importance remains undiminished. And I just talked about the four factors of capital. Over time, the connotation changed. In the decolonization of the colonies was definitely a very, very critical driver of the process of thinking about development in the context of distribution. This is more so because when the decolonization happened, many of the development policy thinkers as well as economists, they started looking at, suppose, the nations of the South Asia as well as Africa, and found that it's not that all the nations or all the people are rich. There are poor people who are suffering from poverty, who are suffering from hunger, who simply can't have 2 square meals a day, who simply can't afford to send their children to school. Now, Theodor Schultz, that was in fact in the 1960s, he was the first to recognize the need for one very, very critical component, that is the need for human capital formation. So eventually this connotation changed, and he was the first person who essentially thought that education and training are critical prerequisites, and he identified the phenomenon of brain drain from the third world to the first world. Of course, we don't use the term third world these days. Then, in fact, you have William Lewis, Hans Singer, and others who came up with these notions that, well, the development should be looked as growth plus change, and change is not only economic but also social and cultural. So eventually, when we are looking at this entire process of transition from growth to development, the emergence is happening as, fine, you have growth, but what about the fruits of growth? Who is enjoying the fruits of growth? So, in fact, in the 1960s, Gunnar Myrdal, he supported Sears' views, and in Mehboob-ul Haq, that was a very, very critical paper in 1971, where he used this term specifically, that we were taught to take care of GNP as if this is going to take care of poverty. Let us reverse this and take care of poverty so that this takes care of GNP. Well, so far so good. So we are talking about efficiency, we are talking about equity, that is distribution. But what about the aspect of sustainability of growth? So when we are talking about equity, we are essentially talking about distribution across space. What about distribution across time? So if we use up all the resources of the world, fine, we have been talking about dualism, we have been talking about population growth, we have been talking about inequality, we may be talking about urbanization, we are talking about agricultural transformation, education, health, unemployment. These need to be viewed on their own merits, and not merely as appendages to an underlying growth thesis. But what about the sustainability of this very process? And this took a new twist when, in fact, and became more prominent in the 1990s, when the very sustainability of economic development were being questioned by the environmentalists because of the grave concerns about the growing environmental crisis. We, of course, had the Club of Rome thesis, in fact, in the late 60s, early 70s, which questioned the very sustainability of the growth, and which was, of course, I would call it the doomsday thesis to a certain extent, and it talked about the apocalypse. Now, eventually, what we had was, over time, we started talking about the Millennium Development Goals, which the era of the 8 MDGs, which came into being during this millennium. And the 8 MDGs essentially talked about halving the extreme poverty rates, to halting the spread of HIV or AIDS, and providing universal primary education, to talking about environmental protection. And all these targets were, in fact, to be achieved by the target date of 2015. More critically, the MDGs formed a blueprint which were agreed by all the world's countries and the entire world's leading development institutions. They galvanized an unprecedented effort to meet the needs of the world's poorest and the environment. The tenure of the MDGs, or the Millennium Development Goals, came to an end in 2015, and all the United Nations members, they adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which entailed essentially a shared vision of peace, a shared vision of prosperity, a shared vision of a conflict free planet across space and time. And at the very core of this global call are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which we call the SDGs, that emphasize that humanity can survive and flourish on this planet with all other species, and development of human society need not entail destruction of the natural ecosystem and biodiversity. Rather, it's the opposite. There is a huge dependence of the human society on what we call the ecosystem services. That is, the services provided by the ecosystem free of cost to the human society. So the SDGs stress on ending poverty and deprivation, reduce inequality, improve health and education, spur economic growth, all while tackling climate change and working to preserve our oceans and planets. Now, the most critical element is SDG 17, which talks about global partnership to realize the 16 other goals. So, when I talk about, use the term global development governance, essentially these SDGs are the most critical limbs, the most critical cornerstones of global development governance. Uh, on the other hand, if you look at how essentially I conceptualize the entire framework of global development governance, I often pose this as the problem of the irreconcilable trinity, a triad, the trinity of reconciling between the trade-off between equity, efficiency, and sustainability. So if I look at it as a triangle, an equilateral triangle, all three goals are equally critical. You need to have efficiency, you need to grow, you need to have equity, there has to be distributive justice, there has to be proper distribution, which of course Amartya Sen has been stressing on this for quite some time. Mehbubul Haq, Gunnar Mirdal, they have all been stressing on this. Now comes the third pillar of this triangle, which is sustainability. Now, is it that I'm going to use up all the resources to meet the development needs of the present generation, and the future generation is going to suffer another pandemic? Can we really think of such a world? So we have to think of growth on the one hand, have to think of spatial equity or spatial distribution element on the other hand, we have to think of temporal distribution on the other hand. And this is the most critical challenge of not only global development governance, but in fact governance at all levels, whether it's at a national level or even at a more micro level.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. I think this debate probably is going on since ages, and we have first introduced to this debate in our development economics class when this was discussed. I can see that many have posted questions, so can we take a few questions now before
Yes,
we
please.
move forward? So this is a question from Dr. Pinaki Dattagupta. He is asking if you can explain short-term and long-term economy recovery plan for engineering and project organization, where physical progress at construction field is affecting now and will be affected in future also. Few more. What will be the impact from Taskin Zaidi? What will be the impact of COVID-19 on education sector? There's one more question from Shravan. How can growth of agriculture, especially farmers, to come up, and how long will take back to normals, especially need to focus to food and agriculture development? Dr. Ghosh, are you there?
I'm there. I see
Yeah.
the
One question, of course, is as I told you about the education sector impact. Second question, agriculture sector. Third question is that engineering and project organization. So these are the three questions we can take, and we can take few more questions if time permits.
See, one very critical element that I can feel right now, I don't know that how essentially the growth driver is going to emerge. But if you look at generally the Indian growth driver, essentially right from the 1990s, it has been, first of all, the services. And the second is that the Indian growth story has been a consumption driven growth story. As far as the manufacturing sector is concerned, some of the critical things is that we can offer the governmental shops. There has, the protection has already been, a host of protection has been offered over time. But even then, the sector has not really been to the extent of meeting up to the expectations. It has lost out on the competition with the ASEAN. It has lost out on the competition with, and more critically, with the cost competition and the price competition with China. Now, the other element that we have to look at is China is no more going to be the trusted partner. Well, how do we project essentially the Indian counterpart under such circumstances when China is no more the trusted partner? Already, in fact, there are several US companies and the companies of the European Union who are showing interests in India. The critical element right now is essentially promoting three or four factors of capital. One is, of course, the human capital element. Now, and of course, the fiscal measures. The fiscal measures are going to be critical, but at the same time, what we need is to beef up the ease of doing business. Now, this by ease of doing business, I simply don't mean the World Bank or the DPIIT indicators. The DPIIT indicators are not really the ground level indicators, but the more critical indicators have emerged. In fact, ones that have been developed by the Asian Competitiveness Institute (ACI), the National University of Singapore. Those are talking about the ground level conditions, the implementation of the reforms. Now, we have a huge amount of what we call the natural capital, and we have the engineering sector, the manufacturing sector has simply not lived up to using that. Uh, Now, if you look at Orissa, the large bauxite belt of Orissa has, which was essentially a very conflict-prone region, the Maoist belt. To a certain extent, they have now been converted to growth drivers. Growth drivers in the sense, especially because of large-scale investments that happened with the Aditya Birla Group coming up. Then, in fact, the Vedanta Group coming up there. So, and people, local employment has already been generated. The Odisha government came up with the right kind of SOPs. We need to have one very, very critical element is the land reforms out here. Can we have a better land acquisition act if we at all have to get into large scale manufacturing industry? The transaction costs, especially in some of the eastern states where you have a very large natural capital base, is very high. One of the eastern states is, of course, West Bengal. The Land Acquisition Act out here is fraught with a host of transaction costs, and one very critical transaction cost happens to be the syndicate, the kind of politicizations. So these are what we call the political transaction costs. How do we essentially bring about this land reforms? Think about the Northeast. The Northeast is going to be a critical driver when we talk about the natural capital. We have a huge base of human capital, cheap human capital as far as Eastern India is concerned, but we didn't allow the manufacturing sector to develop to that extent. So, in fact, first of all, it requires the ground level reforms, which is going to reduce the costs of transaction, reduce the cost of acquisition, and in fact, in the process, will allow the industries to be set up in these regions, which can boost up the manufacturing sector to that extent. But again, let me emphasize, it's not going to be the manufacturing sector which will be the growth driver for India. It is always going to be the services, because if you set up one manufacturing unit, you will find at least suppose and that generates employment of say 500 people or 1000 people. You will find that the services around it is generating employment for 25,000 or 30,000 people. So services have a larger multiplier effect, and that has been the growth story of India over the last 30 years.
Another question was on the impact on the education sector and the agriculture sector.
So education sector, I'm not going to differentiate it from the services. This is, of course, a very, very critical element of services. But the most important element out here is that it is the education sector which creates skilled human capital, which is one of the most critical element of, if I talk about, of the production process. So the education sector by itself, as you can see, in fact, all of you are from the education sector. It's moving to the virtual. We are already moving towards the virtual classroom by itself. So the services generally is going to move to the virtual space. There is going to be contraction of the physical space as far as the services are concerned. It's already happening, and it is going to happen even more when all these non-essential commodities are being allowed to be traded, in fact, in the e-commerce platforms. Maybe, in fact, I'm not going to call the local plumber. I might fetch somebody from Urban Clap. So, on the other hand, as far as education is concerned, there will be some very, very critical. I mean, human capital is concerned. There will be some very, very critical skill sets that are going to be in demand, and these are going to be more so because of the movement in the virtual space out here. So, say teachers, there might be excellent teachers, in fact, in the classroom in the physical format, but if they are not digitally aware, I really don't know whether in the new world that we are emerging, whether they will be fitting in and to what extent. So everybody has to update themselves. That's what it seems as far as the new world order is concerned. So this is, of course, something that we feel it's going to emerge. But of course, there is nothing to replace the physical proximity of the classroom, because you can feel the body language, you can see the body language of the professor and the teacher, and of course the students, and that creates a different kind of atmosphere altogether. But it seems that it's going to be a 50-50 kind of a scenario in the emerging times.
Okay, Dr. Ghosh, we're getting some very interesting questions. Probably we'll take it up later on. We can continue with our discussion for the time being. We've got some very interesting questions. I would like to, because some of the questions, some of it we probably will cover in our next section. But definitely, let us go back to the discussion that we are having. It's an important topic that hit the headlines a few days back. And in fact, when I first read, my initial reaction was, how would have David Ricardo reacted if he was alive? Negative oil price in response to the pandemic. So my question to you, Dr. Ghosh, is it just an aberration, or do you think it's actually a organic market-based phenomenon?
It is a market-based phenomenon when markets are manipulated, first of all. And it is, of course, an aberration at the same time. As far as you know, in fact, that the Indian markets keep on following the signals of the global commodity markets, especially when it comes to crude, natural gas, and of course the precious metals. Though, but prices that are realized, in fact, in this derivatives markets, especially the commodities derivatives markets, are not really reflections of the scarcity values of these resources, and there lies the inefficiency of the global commodity markets. Now, what all I would like to state here is that it needs to be understood that the negative price has prevailed in the oil futures market, largely due to, of course, the demand has been declining because of the pandemic. We can't really ignore that fact. But the negative prices prevailed in the oil futures market largely due to the apprehended, what we call the carrying cost, which is one of the major components of the overall transaction cost. That means the global economy is already under closure. There is a decline in the demand for fossil fuel. The concern is that under efficient market conditions, the clearing market prices should ideally, at worst, should have been zero and not negative. So one definition or explanation of the negative price is that the carrying costs that essentially entail what we call the inventory costs, then the interest cost, the storage cost, these are prohibitively higher than either the negative settlement prices, of course, the negative settlement prices, and also the expected payoff in absolute sense after the global economy resumes. In that sense, the price of the crude is definitely not reflecting what we call the scarcity value of the resource, because the resources are getting scarce. It of course has an use, more so because we have not, say, the growing nations like India, China, and others, the developing world, they have not really moved away from the fossil fuel, or what we call the fossil fuel fetishism. So, in that sense, you simply cannot have a phenomenon of zero price, but there should have been some value to it. But what we have is a negative price. So, this is also due to the market imperfections that arise out of what we call in economics the bounded rationality of agents who are not able to foresee the future. And also because of the fact that there are information impurities, imperfect information in the system. The futures market is speculative. 99% speculation. I mean, you find that speculative trading essentially is 99%, and that's not bad. Actually, it's the speculators who provide liquidity to the market. But the speculative market largely thrives on apprehensions and myopia. And this is bound to have its own bearings on the physical market, as efficient futures markets are being viewed as mirrors of the physical or the spot counterparts. But at the same time, one needs to be very careful about this negative price phenomenon. It is neither desired nor, in fact, useful. It's a clear dampener for the entire commodity economies and acts as a disincentive for the primary producers and also the owners, in fact, in the entire commodity ecosystem. It sends across a wrong signal of the state of availability of resource. If it is a scarce resource, how can its price be negative? And which is of use. As a result, this will lead to an adverse management regime of an exhaustible resource. Crude is an exhaustible resource, after all. Do we really intend to have a gross product value of a resource as negative on the basis of this price? This is simply, I mean, if you look at it from a pure factor income perspective, this leads to the values of factors of production of the exhaustible resource as negative. Further, the very negative price, on the other hand, it defeats the very purpose of valuation, as valuation plays an important role in resource allocation. It raises public awareness about the importance of the resource, guides legal proceedings for determining damages where a party is held liable for the losses to another party. So it is one way, it is a market, it is definitely an aberration. At the same time, it's a market driven aberration. That's how I would like to put this phenomenon. So regulators, so it's also a concern of if I mean, definitely there are finance guys, in fact, listening to this. It's also a concern of the design of the futures contract product itself. So one needs to be very, very careful. Now that I read today that in India, multi-commodity exchange MCX, they have been become very wary of this particular phenomenon because there were quite a few open positions which essentially led to some problems for the those who had the short positions. So eventually they are correcting for this, so that a settlement doesn't happen in the negative price, and they are correcting the very futures contract precisely because of that.
Thank you. Very interesting, actually. In fact, price becoming negative for a resource which is exhaustible, that is something unthinkable. Dr. Ghosh, we are getting some interesting question. If you'd like to respond to some of them, and then we can go to the next part, is that Madhumita Goa Majumdar is asking, how do you think that the shared economy is going to be affected by COVID? And then Supriyo Ghosh is asking, basically he's referring to an interview on BBC Hard Talk yesterday, where the BBC anchor asked the Chinese ambassador to UK about the calls made within UK to disengage from China. The Chinese ambassador responded that this has already been taken care of at highest level of government, and cooperation between China and UK is going to be very strong. So his question is basically that is it a mere wishful thinking that foreign investment will get diverted from China to India? So these are the two questions. One is the impact on shared economy. Second is the question, it's a wishful thinking to think that foreign investment will get diverted from China to India post the pandemic.
So the first one is
It's an impact on shared economy.
impact on shared economy. So let's look at one of the SDGs in this context. Suppose the SDG 17, which we talk about global partnership, uh, essentially to achieve the other development goals. Uh, as far as SDG 17 is concerned, definitely it acknowledges what I stated about this irreconcilable trinity. SDG 17 is bound to get affected to a large extent. Uh, I mean, the challenges by itself, in fact, for meeting across all these other 16 SDGs, they were not easy. They were not really easy goals. They were difficult challenges. I mean, zero hunger, zero poverty. It's probably the challenge which existed right from time immemorial. Of course, at the very outset, we know that this pandemic is going to create very insulated economies. There were already insulating tendencies among economies, and it's going to create even further insulated economies with closure of borders, international migration, as far as partnerships are concerned in various other forms. It has created suspicion among nations, as can be evidenced when US President kept on using the term Chinese virus, China blaming US for the spread. Now that China and US and UK are asking for some form of investigation on the Chinese role in terms of the origin of the virus and spread of the virus. So the pandemic has definitely going to come in the way of realizing SDG 17 in terms of global partnerships for achieving other SDGs, and this is going to happen despite WHO's initiatives. Suspicions are already there with WHO's roles and abilities by certain member nations in this context. On the other hand, as far as the other forms of cooperation is concerned, definitely we are going to look at health is going to be a critical element. There will be some forms of health cooperation, especially to get over this crisis. So this essentially is something very critical that possibly the pandemic is going to create a more insulated world, and this is not going to be very a very comfortable situation as such for the global development governance, or suppose say in terms of the shared initiatives that we are going to think of. Uh, on the other hand, if you're talking of India, definitely I would agree with the statement that yes, India is going to have a major opportunity out here, and more so because I feel that India's East is going to have a greater opportunity. As I mentioned out here, first of all, you have, I mean, China was right from the beginning when they conceptualized the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, they had one very specific economic corridor where India featured. That is the BCIM economic corridor. The BCIM economic corridor is Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar economic corridor. And essentially, their idea was to exploit India's east and northeast. They realized one thing, that as far as the east and northeast of India are concerned, you have a fabulous natural capital, you have cheap human capital, the physical capital is going to be improved. Japan realized that. That is why they have been investing in the northeast quite a bit. And of course, you have deeply entrenched social values, social security, and other things which essentially create the social capital, social relations, and institutions. So now this is something that is, and more importantly, this part is largely untapped. So the rates of return in an untapped region is going to be pretty high. That is essentially the idea. So, so of course, when you are looking at China with suspicion, there are regions which you are going to explore, and one of the regions is definitely going to be India. And there is one very critical advantage with India. If you look at the eastern part, you have all these factors of production, particularly the four Ks, the four capitals, available in abundance. So that creates a very lucrative factor market. On the other hand, what you have is a 135 billion plus consumer base, whose incomes over time, at least prior to the pandemic, has increased over the last 10 years at an average of 6.5 to 7%. So where will you find such a huge consumer base and such a fabulous factor base? So you produce things in the east, and maybe in fact you find your market in the west and the north and the south. So what else do you need in here? And then in fact, on the other hand, if you can exploit the global value chains, maybe in fact shift have some portions of your production in your own nation, where you find cheap to produce certain portions and shift some of the assembly lines to eastern parts of India, or suppose even in labor surplus economies like Myanmar, you might find that these are turning out to be cheaper products, and you can simply turn out to be globally extremely competitive, even beating the competition from China and the ASEAN. So this is going to be extremely critical, and India will, though India doesn't feature prominently in the global value chain presently, but there's no harm hoping that India is definitely one of the very critical destinations and will feature very critically over the next 10 years in the global value chain.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. We are getting a few more questions, but probably we'll take it up. My next question to you is, what will be the state of the job market in India? What will be India's imperatives? What do you have to say about it?
See, as far as the job market is concerned, as I stated, that the services are going to be the growth driver. Though, in fact, if at all, let's face it, though when Make in India was also conceptualized, you will find that of the 25 or 26 odd sectors that were announced, you talked about industrialization, manufacturing, but at least 17 or 18 of them, more than 70 of them, belong to the services sector. So the manufacturing base, or there hasn't been that large scale vision as far as India is concerned to develop this as a manufacturing base. The vision has always been geared towards developing this as a service base. Forget about the past. What the dream that
And
Jawaharlal Nehru
infrastructure
had.
also had a role to play, right? Moving
Infrastructure
from
is the physical capital.
yes,
Infrastructure is the physical
so we
capital.
moved from manufacturing to service because of infrastructure
Of course.
bottlenecks,
So,
of course.
yes, and more so because, see, if we can keep on serving the humanity from anywhere I like. I don't have to go to the factory for suppose talking to you, or suppose even for taking lectures in your classes. You don't have need the physical infrastructure out there. All you need is the internet. At the same time, if you look at the consulting firms, if you look at banking and finance, if you look at analytics, if you look at e-commerce, if you look at even suppose say the other forms of services, including the financial institutions or the stock markets, you find they are still operating even during times of pandemic. But it is essentially those spaces which need the physical infrastructure beyond the internet, and the physical space, a building for which you have to travel, or suppose you have to use them physically. Those are the ones which have faced the closure. Now, here comes the critical role. If services turn out to be the growth driver, what is going to happen to the large unorganized sector, which also fall in the purview of the services? I mean, it's going to be extremely difficult to bring them in the framework of this networked world, of the internet, of in the in the view of my Google world. So I really don't know how that is going to emerge, and that is going to be one of the very, very critical development governance challenge as far as the Indian policy paradigm is concerned. So the large, are we going to have services only in the web platform, and essentially sacrificing the needs of the large unorganized sector in the services that has thrived in and around the physical space of either the primary or the secondary sectors? This is a very, very critical challenge.
There's a question from Mr. Swapan Mukhopadhyay who is asking is that what will be the impact of this pandemic? It's talking about on small scale business. What will be the business forms or modalities post corona pandemic on small scale business?
Uh, s- s- it's a very interesting question and a difficult one to answer as well, because this is going to have a very mixed kind of a response. Those who are in fact covered under the ambit of the web and have moved to the digital platform are going to flourish undoubtedly, however small scale they are. But at the same time, let us remember one very critical thing, that it's the local kirana store which, even when the big basket was not supplying, or suppose the other web platforms were not supplying, we survived during the pandemic because of the local kirana store. So, well, it's going to be a mixed response that the pandemic is going to have. But the small scale sector, they have to adapt to this. But can they meet up with the price competition? Now, out here, one very critical thing that happens is that the government has to protect them. It's if you leave it to only to the measurement bar of efficiency, the small scale sector won't be in a position essentially to compete as far as price competition or scale economies are concerned with the large scale sector, with the large scale industries. So there has to be a space that needs to be created, and here comes the very critical equity dimension of development, and where essentially the fiscal measures as well as physical protection needs to be offered to them.
Okay, there's another question from Akriti Jain. She's asking what will be the impact on the tourism sector considering it has an important share in the GDP. And there's a question from Dr. Asit Barma that how do you see the prospect of India attracting the contract manufacturing from China?
Tourism sector is going to be affected quite a bit, no doubt about that. Insulating economies, that's what we are going to witness. At least till the time the vaccine is there, you simply cannot expect the kind of growth that the tourism sector essentially witnessed over the last 10 years. And even you can pretty well make out that all forms of regional connectivity projects or global connectivity projects are going to get affected. So it's just not going to be there. Second question is, sorry, can you just repeat the second question?
Do you think India can attract the industries moving their manufacturing away from China?
I have some doubts in here when it comes to manufacturing. When it comes to services, I don't have much doubts. Yes, India can do that. When it comes to manufacturing, you already have the ASEAN, which have, they already have the manufacturing base out there. They have already created the processes. They have already created the products. They have the trading. They have the vibrant labor market out there as far as manufacturing is concerned. The only thing that can go in favor of India as compared to ASEAN is that Eastern India has a cheap labor market. So you can simply source in cheap labor from East and the Northeast. But what about the process by itself? Can we really match up with the cost competition as far as ASEAN is concerned? So when it comes to manufacturing, I have my doubts that probably large parts of it are going to move to the Southeast Asian nations who are already having a better processes, better contracts, better IPR rules, and better labor laws as well. Because we still have very fragmented labor laws as far as India is concerned, and this has created very fragmented labor markets as well. So, I mean, at one level, we just recognize that there are 1024 labor statutes as far as India is concerned, and this increases the entire cost of transaction in the labor market. Think of state-specific Shop and Establishment Act. Think of state-specific other acts in terms of the Factories Act. So these are some very critical problems that we have in India. Until and unless we have these reformed, we have a better trained labor, human capital base, and we have cheaper ways of sourcing the capital, as also reduction of the transaction cost through better land acquisition processes, lower amounts of red tapeism and lower amounts of bureaucratic shackles. Well, we may go ahead, but presently I am not so hopeful as far as manufacturing is concerned, but I am extremely hopeful as far as services are concerned.
Dr. Ghosh, one last question before I ask my question. This is from Ayan Mandul. His question is, more and more retail businesses are filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the States, with 33 million filing for unemployment along with Trump's no migration policy. So basically what he's asking is that, in effect, what would be the likely scenario for Indian companies in USA?
see this, as I stated, that this insulating tendency was actually observed for quite some time in the US, and definitely this xenophobia, this xenophobic discernment of the US policies have definitely not gone well with large parts of the developing world, including China and India. So definitely, with the way Trump has been looking at things, it's not very hopeful. At the same time, this pandemic creates a bigger pressure. There is no doubt about that. Uh, but whether we should be looking at only US as the market, or whether we should be looking at other growing markets, there is a need to diversify. There is a need to diversify, in fact, in regions. See, I completely understand why we needed the United States of America. It was like a supermassive black hole, which is going to consume anything and everything within its vicinity. So they had very, very high consumption propensity. It created a huge consumer base. But let us, there's a need for these corporates, this whether you talk about the Chinese Alibaba, or whether you talk about the Indian supermarkets, or whether you talk about other Indian corporates, there's a need to diversify and look at other destinations which are sufficiently growing, especially uh, the especially one destination is definitely India. India by itself is going to grow with driven by the services. Then the other destination is going to be the ASEAN. We also need to look at Africa. Africa is going to be a very, very critical destination in years to come, and you have a subcontinent or a continent by itself which essentially provides factors of production in abundance, and where essentially it's quite cheap. The biggest transaction cost that comes when you have to essentially deal with Africa is in terms of your security, because security, in the sense I mean pure physical security. It's a conflict prone region, and that really creates the threat of discontinuity of business. But in any case, in fact, you invested in China, and already yesterday there was a very, very interesting article by Brahma Chalani in the Wall Street Journal, which specifically mentioned how essentially the value chains are getting fragmented and broken, and there has been discontinuity in business because many of the corporates in US and European Union, they set up their shops, in fact, in China, and they have been complaining because of the discontinuities of business because of the massive lockdown, and the impact that the pandemic had on human capital. And this impact is going to be, it's not going to go away in the near future.
There's one question before, one more question. I think many actually asking the same question. What will be the impact on the agriculture sector?
Well, I don't see any direct impact on the agricultural sector as such on the production side, but the bigger problem is, the problem persists today, whether it's because of the pandemic or without the pandemic. The problem with agriculture has perennially been with the entire supply value chain. Uh, this entire supply chain has been problematic because of leakages. Then, in fact, the agricultural supply ecosystem by itself. We attempted, in fact, when I was the chief economist of MCX, at one point in time, we outsourced our studies for a very narrow commodity, that is menthol, essentially, to track the value chain in agriculture, essentially the supply value chain, considering how it is going, how the roles of the intermediaries and others. Partially we were successful in getting across some of the major nodes, but then we found that within maybe across two nodes of the value chain, there was suddenly some kind of a price shock happening. We couldn't make out how that is happening. So far there hasn't been any successful study which has essentially discerned and delineated properly how this agricultural value chain has behaved, and how price transmission happens across the various nodes of the value chain, and how the leakages also happen. So the distribution channel in agriculture is extremely important. So it's the productivity of the low productivity in Indian agriculture are because of two, three factors, and the distress of the farmers, small farmers, are because of two, three factors. The first is that aggregators have not always worked in favor of the what we call the marginal farmers or the very small farmers. They have largely worked in favor of the medium and the big farmers. So naturally, the marginal farmers have not been integrated properly with the market. Now, this is a phenomenon whether you have the pandemic or no pandemic. So then, in fact, the second issue is with the leakages that keep on happening across these distribution channels, and eventually the price hikes or the or what we call the essentially uh, the price uh, I mean the kind of price transmission mechanism which gets tampered in the process through the intermediaries. That is, of course, another mystery. Suppose, say, this is something that we have noticed in the cases of onions. In fact, when the onion prices, I recall, in fact, in 2012-13, when I was staying in Mumbai, I used to go often from to the Nasik highway from Mumbai to Shirdi, and in fact, that was an onion growing belt, and onion prices were as high as 80 rupees or 100 rupees a kg, in fact, in Mumbai. And the farmers all across the highway, they were actually sitting with sacks or the boras of onions and selling each bora, which probably had 10 to 15 kg of onion, at 20 rupees a kg, at 20 rupees a bora, a sack. That is barely 1 to 2 rupees a kg. So one can make out the kind of price hike that keeps on happening across this entire agricultural value chain. So this is an essential problem which the government has not really worked, or even if it has worked, it has not been successful.
Thank you, and I'll come to the last question. I think I've already covered everything, but still, if you just have to very briefly have to tell us that how do you think India should position itself in the new global economic order?
See, one very critical element that I always feel when it comes to ease of doing business is that ease of doing business, as far as the World Bank indicators are concerned, it's primarily related to the policy reforms. These policies are operating at a more macro scale and doesn't often boil down or translate to the ground level. In a very, I mean, last year, when we were looking at the SDG index developed by the Niti Aayog, we found that there are certain loopholes. So we tried, in fact, developing a separate sustainable development goal index across the Indian states. And while we were studying this entire phenomenon of the SDGs, we found that it's very interesting. It has all these 4Ks, which I just discussed, that is physical capital, human capital, natural capital, and social capital. These are all embedded in these SDGs. So then we pose this hypothesis: are these SDGs, the most efficient indicator of business competitiveness? If these are the factors, suppose you talk about ending poverty, you talk about education, you talk about inequality, these are all factors affecting essentially human capital. Then you have efficiency indicators like economic growth, industrialization, and others, which are essentially indicators of physical capital, also infrastructure, physical capital. Then you have other forms of capital, such as social capital, which talks about peace, then in the social institutions and others. And you have natural capital, life below water, life on land. So we did an econometric exercise and we tried to regress this index over to other over essentially the FDI movement across states, number one, and the ease of doing business index developed by the National University of Singapore. And what we found was that this SDG index is a very, very important and a significant, statistically significant determinant, statistically significant explanatory factor of this ease of doing business as developed by the Asian Competitiveness Institute, as also the fact that FDI is getting drawn towards those destinations where this SDG index values are pretty high. So this essentially led us to a certain extent, indicatively infer that probably nations, economies, and states should work more on SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, for enabling, or rather creating enabling business conditions. And these are extremely critical, more critical than actually doing all those policy level reforms or reforms at a very macro level. So if you talk about human capital, fine, get them trained, give them the means essentially to develop themselves, create the right kind of physical infrastructure which can essentially boost your physical capital. This is exactly what essentially sustainable development goals have been asking for. So why don't you do that? So that is the moot point, that if India has to position itself, in fact, in this entire global order, it has to work on its SDGs. That is number one. Number two is it has to work, in fact, in a very critical way, as being a very interesting soft power in the sense, putting it just as Modi did just prior to the pandemic, putting in some money, in fact, in the SARC platform and reactivating the SARC. So that creates a brand. And eventually we feel that, okay, India is a soft power. India is a state which it is a democratic nation. It listens to listens to voices where there is proper information dissemination. Where there is what we call the information dilution and the contaminations. These are low, and eventually you can. It is also a friendly neighbor, which even when you have hostile neighbors all around, it is putting in money for friendly neighbors when neighbors are in a problem in a situation like this, that of the pandemic. So these are some very, very critical elements by way of which India should position itself in the new global economic order.
Thank you, Dr. Nilanjan. Extremely interesting, actually.
Thank you.
Working on SDGs to attract business, something we need to work on. Thank you for such a wonderful session. I'm sure that everyone enjoyed the session. We have actually received a lot of questions, but we are sorry we will not be able to respond to all the questions. Dr. Ghosh will not be able to respond to all the questions. But thank you, Dr. Ghosh, for your time and for this insightful discussion.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for some very interesting questions from you as well as from the audience. And thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much.